DubbieDubbie crew, it's me, John, your big pal here again with another discussion about the OGL. The OGL 1.1, 1.2, all the different OGLs that are out there, and best of all, the OGL 1.0. If you're new to the channel tuning in for the first time, my name's John, I'm a business analyst, and I'm spending my time here today discussing the business behind the changes coming with the OGL between Wizards of the Coast and between their competitors. And it's a little bit of a different video today. Instead of spending all my time talking about Wizards of the Coast, they have to come up a little bit for this, but really I want today to have the focus on Paizo, the makers of Pathfinder, Starfinder, sort of the biggest competitor to Wizards of the Coast, and how they're doing throughout these changes as well. So first of all, before I jump in, for anyone whose comments I haven't answered yet, I will be getting to them in a future video as well. I want to make sure that all of that is given the attention it deserves, but thank you, sincerely thank you for the comments that you're leaving. It's helping to make the channel in the direction that you guys want to see, and I love being able to hear my own voice talk about it. I actually hate my own voice recorded, but that's a separate problem. For those of you who are also new to the channel, if you could do me the biggest favor of all and like the video, leave a comment about what types of things you'd like to see in the business world discussed, in the D&D world, in any of D&D's competitors, in Magic the Gathering. Pick a game, pick what you want to talk about with it, and I'm going to be happy to delve into it as well. But if you could like and subscribe to the video, it does me a world of good to make sure that I'm on the right track with the content that you guys want to see. So all of that aside, let's jump into what I want to talk about today, which is Paizo's Persuasion. So for those who are new to the topic, recently, over the last, it's really only been like 3 or 4 weeks at this point here, it's all moving very quickly, Wizards of the Coast had, not on purpose, I think someone leaked it on their behalf, let's say, had a new version of the OGL, or the online gaming license, that would be leaked, that shows that what they were looking to do is to take the open game license, I think I said the online gaming license, it's the open gaming license, and taking that, scrapping it entirely for the people who would be using what's allowed to be used through the OGL that Wizards of the Coast had originally drafted back in the year 2000, and would now be replacing it with originally what looked like would be something where you'd be paying royalties for the privilege of using their properties. So something went from completely open to completely closed, and you can use it, but if you're making enough money, you're going to have to pay royalties. They've since dialed that back a little bit. They're in discussions as to what this would look like for the community, but the short of it is the old agreement that many other companies and content creators have relied on is going to go the way of the dodo. It will be gone at some point, and it will not look like it was, and the community is understandably taking it well, and by well, I mean it's the end of the world as we know it. And I'm here to put that into context, and so far in my past videos, which you should totally check out if you haven't already, you can see through the past videos that I've been explaining why Wizards of the Coast kind of has to make this decision. And one of that comes down to my golden rule for companies, which is all companies need to, at all times, find more ways to make money. They don't have a morality behind it, they just have to make money. So we've talked ad nauseum about that with Wizards of the Coast. Great. Let's look at some of their competitors and some of the other players in these changes with the OGL. And the main other competitor that I want to put in the focus on today is Paizo, because Paizo is playing this absolutely perfectly. I want to be clear, that does not mean they're going to win, although they might end up somewhere that looks like winning, and that'll be because of the large disparity between the direction that Wizards of the Coast and Paizo want to go, but also the big disparity between the company size. Wizards of the Coast is a behemoth, Paizo is a small company by pretty much any measure that you would want to have, and that means an interesting thing could happen where they both end up ahead. And if I were to give the credit to any company in that situation, I would say, therefore, Paizo played this really, really well. And I also want to make sure that I'm clear to everyone who's watching. My purpose here is not to explain whether I think these changes are good for the community, whether they are going to kill Dungeons and Dragons or any other role-playing game. It's not to do any of that. All of those are good questions. They're probably better handled by some other people, but if you guys would like my personal opinion on those things, I'm happy to give it as well. But my purpose here today, and for this entire series, is to go into the business logic that would go into this. Just whether the moves that these different companies and players in the game are making are good moves to make, or whether they're bad moves to make for their stated goals and what we understand their goals to be. And I know that for many people, That's a world that you don't spend a lot of time thinking of, and I happen to be in the privileged position to get to think about that, or be forced to think about it, depending on your point of view, pretty much all day for my day job. So I'm going to share that knowledge with you guys. So let's talk about PAIZO'S Persuasion for a minute. Persuasion, of course, doesn't mean that your argument is moral or good. Just, can you take an argument and further your own goals by getting other people to agree with you? And in this game, I've labeled Wizards of the Coast as having a B tier grade. In other words, even though I do think Wizards of the Coast is going to ultimately win with the OGL, their way of doing it, not whether it's morally good or not, but just in terms of how persuasive and how good their argument has been for doing it, is okay, but not great. It's passable. It's certainly enough for them to be able to continue, but they've made some key mistakes along the way. They had a path to have at least A tier grade persuasion. And in a future video, I'm very much going to go into that, because I do not think you guys would like that path, but I think by the end of that discussion, you will angrily agree with me that Wizards of the Coast could have gotten all of their competitors into a lot more trouble had they done the same argument and the same changes to the OGL, but framed it in a completely different way. But today, the focus is on PAIZO. And PAIZO'S Persuasion and their response to this is S tier. You are not going to see a better response, given the tools that PAIZO has on the table and the resources that they have available to them, than what PAIZO has given. PAIZO'S response to this OGL change is spot on perfect. Looking through it, I cannot imagine a better opportunity for them, that they saw the playing field, saw the options that are available to them, and made the right moves in the right time frame and under the right persuasive framing to be able to end up potentially very far ahead, even if Wizards of the Coast wins the war. Because PAIZO isn't going to win the war. They're just not going to, unless the war they want to win isn't the same as Wizards of the Coast's. And my opinion, it's not the same, and I think they've signaled that very loudly. So I'm going to pop a link up on the screen here for a while, and we'll leave it up there for a little bit, because I'm not doing anything super exciting. As soon as Grace actually puts that up on the screen, though, I'll start shaking my hands, and you guys won't see that, because we have a link here that's actually shown on the screen. It's in the description of the video as well, which is PAIZO'S response, and essentially the announcement that they're going to be creating their own, I'll call it an OGL, but it's really its own beast. It's an open, it stands for ORC, basically. It should be Oracle, but yeah, when you've got an acronym that's going to be close enough to ORC, you should use it. If you're in a tabletop game, that's again, part of their spot-on persuasion. I think they've done a great job. Essentially, what they're proposing is they're very disappointed that this is going away. In the article that they've written here, in their press release that they've released for this, which was a couple of days after the leaking of the OGL, which I'll come back to in a minute, is part of their game that they're playing too. Essentially, in this press release, they're explaining that they don't really benefit under the OGL, but a lot of people that would be their fan fiction writers, their content creators that would be creating content for Pathfinder, for Starfinder, for the other games and entities that they have, while PAIZO themselves don't use that, their content creators, the ones who are just starting to get into that field, do use what PAIZO has access to under the OGL. So PAIZO is agreeing our content creators benefit from the OGL, but we're an established company, we don't benefit from it much anymore. Whether that's believable or not, I want to be clear, S tier persuasion. That is exactly the right thing to say, which is, we don't even need the OGL, the little guys need the OGL, and we're not the little guy. They are the little guy compared to Wizards of the Coast, but compared to you and I and any other content producer, no, PAIZO's its own company, and that's where we come into the logic here a little bit as well. PAIZO is a company, just like Wizards of the Coast. That means they have to follow my golden rule. My golden rule is that all companies need to make the best moves for them to make the most amount of money that they can. And the best move for PAIZO is not the same as the best move for Wizards of the Coast. Why? Well, we've got their numbers for revenue right up here on the screen that you can already see. Wizards of the Coast in 2021 had a revenue of about $1.3 billion. Huge company. It's their first year they were past $1 billion, and they didn't just pass it, they smashed it. They went way past $1 billion in revenue. We also know that Wizards of the Coast in the same year had about $550 million of that revenue is profit. That's a pretty healthy profit margin, all things considered. There's different ways to calculate it, and especially with a company that large, it depends on what's an annual bonus that you're getting for income that you don't expect to get in future years, etc., etc. There's so many different ways to analyze it, but on paper, on the surface, that all looks really, really good. I don't know what PAIZO'S profit is, and it's entirely possible they're not profitable because they're so much smaller. Based on what I can see for an average figure for 2021, it looks like their total annual revenue would be in about the $13 million range. It might be as much as 20, it might be as low as under 10. I'm taking 13 million just because it ends up being a nice round figure to WOTC'S that puts us at an approximate conversation point here, which is PAIZO has revenue that is about 1% of Wizards of the Coast total revenue. They're not a smaller company, they're in completely different classes. They have, other than the content that they're producing, nothing to do with each other. And other than the fact that Wizards of the Coast allows PAIZO to use this material, as well as anyone else. It's not just PAIZO using it, they just happen to be the next biggest ones. So back to PAIZO's press release towards this. Essentially what they're stating is they're disappointed to see the OGL go, but they're more disappointed not for themselves, but for the other content creators. And more importantly than that, more importantly than the distrust and the grief that this is going to foment throughout the community, more important than all of that, it's clear that even if Wizards of the Coast changes in the future, we can no longer trust a company to do this. So here's what PAIZO is going to do on their own dime, according to what they're saying. They're going to hire an outside legal firm. Now, it's an outside legal firm called Azora Law. It's a law firm that is headed by a man named Brian Lewis. He's one of the founding partners, if he's not the only partner throughout there. I guess it wouldn't be a partnership at that point, but he's the person in charge of the company, or at least one of the people in charge of it. And that's an interesting note that they're using him because he's actually, by coincidence, or not so much coincidence, the original drafter of the OGL 1.0 way back in the year 2000. So he's an experienced lawyer. His law firm represents mostly gaming companies in these types of licensing situations. And by all accounts, he's someone who's very, very big on open gaming, not having these types of closed license contracts. In other words, very much a non-fan of what Wizards of the Coast is doing, and very much a fan of the position that PAIZO has chosen to take towards this. So, all on the same page so far. That's awesome. Continuing along that line, what PAIZO is suggesting is open to any company that wants to take part in it. They're going to create their new Open RPG contract license, which is basically going to have the keyword that the OGL 1.0 was missing, which is irrevocable. It's going to be perpetual and irrevocable, and it's not going to be controlled by PAIZO, even though PAIZO is going to pay for all of it through Azora Law. My guess is the bill's not that high because I get the impression that the legal team at Azora Law wants to put this in place as well. And then they're going to find some kind of open source or third party that would be closer to something that would be a charity as opposed to something that would be a company. In other words, they're going to have it not held within any game company so that all the game companies can access it free of charge, access all that information that's shared free of charge, but no one is responsible for it. It should give an extra layer of protection so that you have the confidence as a consumer and the confidence, more importantly, as a content creator, that this is not going to change under your feet. So again, in summary, PAIZO is saying OGL's a flawed document. We do believe that we have a legal case is what they're saying in it, and I'll touch again on that in a moment here. But in short, we understand that this is going to be going away, and we're disappointed this is going away. This makes the game worse. This is against what we believe in, and to prove that we believe in this, we're going to create our own. We're going to make our own new contract. We'll make our own contract with blackjack and hookers. We'll do all the right stuff on our end because Wizards of the Coast has proven they can't be trusted with it. Spot on persuasion, just perfect, standing ovation. That is absolutely what you would want to see with a company in PAIZO's position. Now, let's take some of my experience and read between the lines a little bit. In that same press release, PAIZO just told you they cannot win in court. Yeah, seriously. They told you point blank, we do not have a hope at all of winning in court. Here's why. Let me pose this as a bit of a situation for you. First of all, Paizo did not react to this with surprise. You don't have a press release and the ability or the concept already on paper to look at creating a new open source license that's a brand new concept that hasn't really been tried before in this type of field. You don't come up with that in the span of a couple of days. Any intelligent company, and I want to be clear, Paizo is showing they are just nailing this. They are hitting it right out of the park. Any intelligent company would have been planning for some kind of contingency plan for if Wizards of the Coast decides to repeal the OGL. They are doing the right thing by making it confusing in the community to say, this isn't something you should be able to revoke. But anyone who actually understands contract law in any state would state, if you have a contract that is perpetual, meaning it doesn't have an end date or any sort of period of time that it covers, it's nearly impossible to suggest that any party could decide to end that open license whenever they want to. And Wizards of the Coast has said they want to end the license. That's it. It doesn't really go deeper than that. If the contract had said it was irrevocable, if that word was in there, it'd be a totally different discussion. So here's a question. Why isn't the word in there? Interestingly, working with Paizo, if someone who has a bigger audience than I have, my audience is growing, and thank you so much, community, for helping to grow the audience. This is going to help make sure that I can ask these questions as we get bigger as a channel. I have lots of direct questions I'd like to be able to ask to Wizards of the Coast to watch them squirm. I'd have similar questions for Paizo, for Azora Law, and this one, as an example question, is for Azora Law. You happen to have the person who drafted the original OGL 1.0 working for Azora Law, who is clearly unhappy with that kind of setup. So here's my question. We know, and by we, I mean anyone who's studied any degree of law, knows that it's a pretty default clause to have irrevocable in a contract if you want it to be irrevocable. It's clear enough that while you can certainly fight in court to state that a contract was obviously intended to be irrevocable, if it doesn't say it in the contract, it's a huge uphill battle. And remember, a huge uphill battle against Wizards of the Coast with this level of revenue, owned by Hasbro, which again has even more revenue than this, against Paizo with $13 million revenue. Who knows how much of that is profit? It could be zero profit, for the record. Paizo might not actually make money at the moment. They might have expenses that total that same amount. How much debt does Paizo have? I don't know. If someone has figures towards that, I'd be happy to analyze them for you. But it's very possible that Paizo is full of debt, is not making a profit even though they have a healthy enough revenue. And all of that would tell me no one would fight that in court. Here's the point. Paizo sat down with their lawyers, probably went and talked to the guys at Azora Law, because that is their legal team. They probably are small enough they don't have their own in-house legal team, but if they did, they would work with those people as well. They would see at some point in the past that the OGL would be under attack. As an aside, why would they know the OGL would be on the table? Well, it's not that big a community. Remember, Paizo is also in Washington State, just like Wizards of the Coast is. How much exchange between employees do they have? All it would take is for there to have been a big enough change at Wizards of the Coast for them to say, I bet they're making a move now. What would that big change be? Oh, I don't know, new CEO at Wizards of the Coast, for example. Here's what happens in case you haven't worked for a large company that would have a CEO changeover. After the celebrations are done, after they've drunk all the champagne and smoked all the cigars and done all the other fun celebratory things that they all talk about with their tens of millions of dollars of salary, after that's all done, the new CEO will typically do a review of all the businesses that are there. Now, this isn't an in-depth review. I do think Cynthia Williams is pretty smart, and I think she knows her stuff, but that stuff is probably not accounting or law. It's probably not any of those things. The CEO wouldn't need to know those. They hire people who know that stuff for them. So when she's getting projects reviewed to her, it's not really about what the company's already doing. What it's really about is what your middle management and your upper management, who would really like to become vice presidents at some point. Why would you want to be a vice president instead of a manager? Salary's probably 10 or 20 times higher. Like, it's a pretty obvious reason. All of those middle managers are now saying, I could say that we're just doing the normal stuff we're meant to do. I could say that. And I would look like I'm a normal average person to the new CEO who could decide to give me millions of dollars instead of tens of thousands of dollars. It's an option. Or I could talk about those ideas that I wasn't listened about before. Or even I could steal someone else's idea. At some point, someone mentioned to Cynthia Williams, there's this OGL thing. We're just letting people use our product at some point. And she said, whoa, what? You guys are just giving it away? And it's like, yeah, we set it up a long time ago when it was more beneficial to us, but it isn't beneficial. We don't really need it anymore, but we're still doing it. And she would say, legal team, why? Like, why are we doing this? Why? We're meant to make money, not give money away. Why are we doing this? And the legal team would say, well, in good faith, we're kind of bound to this agreement. And she would say, good faith meaning we don't have a legal reason to get rid of it? And the lawyers would say, well, nothing's a guarantee. Lawyers tend to be pretty conservative as people. Nothing's a guarantee. There's a risk with everything that's involved. But no, you could revoke it. And then that's it. It's done. Revoke it then. Find a way to revoke it. That's what would have happened. Well before it was leaked to us, the public, someone within Wizards of the Coast would have either started working at Paizo and said, hey, I was in a meeting when they were talking about getting rid of the OGL. Or if they're on a non-disclosure agreement, they say something like, hey, I am not legally allowed to talk about anything, but have you guys checked into the OGL? I sure don't know if anyone's trying to revoke it. That's all perfectly legal to say. That's not violating a non-disclosure because you said they're not trying to revoke it. People can read between the lines and that's perfectly fine. Either way, the OGL being released was not a surprise. So what did Paizo do? Immediately, all leadership at Paizo would have gone and talked to their own lawyers and they would have said, we can sue them if they try to break this, right? And their lawyers would say, does it say it's irrevocable? And Paizo would say, no, but they haven't revoked it yet. And their lawyers would say, does it say it's not revocable? Because that's sort of your key. Does it say they can't stop giving you it? And Paizo would say, no, but look, like, this is all the case we could do. And lawyers would say, yeah, totally. Like, we could go to court and fight it. Going to court's gonna cost you, I don't know, 20,000 man hours. It's gonna drag it on for years. You're probably gonna have all of your stuff on hold for those years while the court suits it out. Wizards of the Coast, they have a lot of money, right? Yeah, okay, so it probably won't stop at one court. They'd probably try to get an injunction to stop it again, have it go to a Supreme Court of Washington. You'd be looking at a couple $1 million. Do you have that? And Paizo would say, come on guys, we're good for it. We're good for it, right? And lawyers would say, yeah, we don't really work on good for it. I'm really sorry, but we don't work that way. We'd kind of want some of that money up front at least. You could give us bonuses after you win, but we're flipping a coin here. And Paizo would have known right out of the gate after those discussions that there's very little they can do. They can't win that case by default. Does that mean there's a 0% chance? No, but how much money is Paizo willing to risk? Wizards of the Coast also doesn't have a guarantee that they win that case, but Wizards of the Coast has money to waste. If they heard that fighting this might cost them $10 million, they'll say, oh, okay, well, no problem. We'll write you a check. Here you go. Like, take it as an advance, it's fine. They just don't need that money that Paizo probably desperately needs. That's the difference between the size of the companies. So what did Paizo do? If you know there's nothing left to do, that you can't win in court, you win in a different court, the court of public opinion. And that's exactly what Paizo did here. They went and they fought in the court of public opinion, and they've already won. It's over for Wizards of the Coast in the court of public opinion. So most of my past videos have been addressing comments and talking from my own knowledge about what I see in the community, which is the community mostly agrees. Paizo has won this. You can feel it, and you're right to feel that. Paizo has won in the court of public opinion. So someone like me would then ask, what's that worth? And my answer is probably nothing to Wizards of the Coast. The court of public opinion is just not needed when the D&D brand is so large. the argument would have to be that people will stop buying Dungeons and Dragons products and stop shopping with Wizards of the Coast, and I just don't see it. I don't see a large enough number shopping elsewhere to prevent Wizards of the Coast from still making so much more profit and just snowballing up. So they get to have their cake by canceling the OGL, and they get to eat it too because they're also going to have all those profits. So it's over, right? Paizo's just out of luck. They threw their Hail Mary pass and it's done. No, not really. There's a chance Paizo lied on their press release and they really do rely on the OGL. But let's say they weren't lying. Let's say they're telling the truth, that their Pathfinder and Starfinder and the other properties that they have stand on their own 2 feet now. Because that's what they kind of said in the press release. They said, we used to rely on it, but we haven't relied on it in a while. We've already changed this under Pathfinder 2nd edition, for example. Let's say that's true. Let's say that's completely true, and they don't need it. Awesome. Why would they violate my golden rule for companies, which is companies always must make money? And if they don't need the OGL, why are they fighting so hard to make this new orc at their own expense just to give it all away to other consumers and other content creators? Simple. For the same reason that Wizards of the Coast created the OGL in the year 2000. Back in 2000, Dungeons and Dragons was in trouble. It wasn't able to be supported and it needed that community help to carry it. Today, it just doesn't need the community support. It's already its own self-perpetually driving machine. It's just that big. Pathfinder's not there. Anything Paizo makes isn't there. So Paizo is now in the position that Wizards of the Coast would have been back in the year 2000. The dollar figures might be different, but the position of the company is the same. Paizo now gets to be the champion of fanfiction, the champion of content creation, and they get to do that under a new open agreement. Why is this new open agreement willing to be irrevocable? Because wouldn't Paizo just at some point in the future get big enough that they would also want to repeal the orc or whatever they're creating? Here's where it's a little depressing if you're a Paizo fan. And where I give a huge kudos to Paizo, because as near as I can tell, Paizo is recognizing they will never be Wizards of the Coast. There just isn't a big enough market to see how quickly Dungeons and Dragons is growing, while Pathfinder's growing, but way down here, right? They're both moving up. The tabletop gamings are growing, but at some point they won't continue growing that large. At some point it changes, and Paizo is smart enough to recognize they can't replace Wizards of the Coast. They'll capitalize on it if they see something like that happening. If Wizards of the Coast screws up somewhere else and they start going down, and the Dungeons and Dragons field, for whatever reason, maybe their movie flops, maybe the whole property just becomes poisoned by, we find out some of the creators have all been serial killers all along, and it just gets tainted in some way outside of anyone's control. Black Swan events happen. That's what we call those type of weird, unplannable events, Black Swan events. You just can't plan for it. Most swans are white. You shouldn't plan for a black swan. But when they happen, you should capitalize on them. Paizo would capitalize on that. So it's totally possible that Paizo could magically take over Wizards of the Coast or Dungeons and Dragons and buy it out from under them. But based on these figures, no, it's not. And if Paizo's willing to sign a contract with content creators that says, in perpetuity and irrevocably, we will always give you access to our content, they are signaling as loudly as they possibly can, our content will never be worth so much that we have to cut you off from it. They are saying, we have a ceiling, and WOTC doesn't have the same ceiling. And that can be depressing. If you're a Paizo fan, I would say take solace in the fact that the company is likely going to be around for a long time, and if you're comfortable with the size that it's at now, it will likely be bigger. But if your hope is that somehow they're going to dethrone Wizards of the Coast, Paizo doesn't think that. That's why they're willing to take the steps that they're willing to take. Back to a question that I was suggesting earlier that people should be asking of the lawyer who was working for Azora Law as well. Brian Lewis is his name. Apologies, Brian, if I have your name wrong here, if you ever do watch this content. I'll ask the question now, and if someone else wants to take this question and ask him directly, please do. I'd be really interested in hearing what his answer is to the question, and I want to be clear, he wouldn't answer the question directly, but how he chooses to answer or come up with his answer would be very telling. My question is this: why didn't the Wizards of the Coast OGL 1.0 why doesn't that contract have the word irrevocable in it? The way I see it is there's two possibilities. One is, no disrespect to Brian Lewis, but one would be he's not a good lawyer. Because it's such a basic tenet of contract law that you have that in there, that to have him miss that, even earlier on in his career, this was back in the year 2000, so he would have been 22 years beyond his practice today. I don't know how long he would have been practicing law at that point, but probably nowhere near as experienced as he is today. But that's the kind of contract law that a law student would put in. It's the kind of thing that makes obvious sense to me, and I'm not a practicing lawyer. So I would expect that he had imagined that. My bet is not that he was an incompetent lawyer who couldn't figure out that this should be in there, that is coming back to haunt him 22 years later. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's a case where he proposed that should be in there, and Wizards of the Coast said no, way back in 2000. That would mean Wizards of the Coast knew when they were drafting this, there could reach a point in the future where we'd be taking it out, where we'd be canceling the OGL. If you put in the word irrevocable, it's irrevocable. We don't get to reverse it. And they knew back in 2000 that they wanted to. I'd like to ask that question to Brian Lewis, and I hope all of you do as well. It's a free question to ask to Azura Law. Why wasn't it in there in the first place? Now, I'm positive his answer would be something like, I don't really comment on past litigation that I did or anything like that. And that's a fair answer. But he might slip up in his answer in some way that lets us know, did he make a mistake? Or was Wizards of the Coast that prescient that at some point they would need to get rid of that? Because if so, I might have to up Wizards of the Coast game a little bit there as well, and I'll give them retroactive credit for thinking of that 2 decades ago, because that'd be a big move. Here's an example of where Paizo could actually get a benefit from this change, even while Wizards of the Coast has Paizo in a position that clearly shows Paizo understands they can't grow to be the same size as Wizards of the Coast. And here's the answer to that. They don't have to. A company will always take the opportunities available to them to make money, but that doesn't mean that every company needs to get to be a billion-dollar company. Every company should have a path to be able to get there, but in the meantime, you'll happily take increases to your money all along. And having more money means you have more options available to you as well. At the moment, with their $13 million revenue, the options that Paizo has are far more limited than if they could increase that. So part of their press release was to foment this type of discourse in the community. Here's why that's important. You've seen it yourselves from amongst the fans of Dungeons and Dragons and the fans of their competitors as well, that people do not like this change. Wizards of the Coast is not getting any credit for this change, and I don't think they deserve it. It's a change designed to hurt the content creator. It just is. Wizards of the Coast was giving you something beneficial, and they're taking it away now. It is something that is meant to anger the community. My point is that Wizards of the Coast doesn't really care because they don't have to. With this level of revenue, they just don't have to care. Paizo has to care. That's why they're taking the opposite stance. They're saying the community is everything to us. That's something a $13 million annual company does, not something a $1 billion company does. A $1 billion company will never tell the customers point blank, you don't matter, but their actions will show you personally, even your super fans, you just don't matter. There's a bigger world out there that we have access to that our competitors just don't. It's just a sad truth of how business works. It's not even sad, it's just business. It's just how it works. But what Paizo could do by fomenting this discourse, by getting the community riled up and angry, what they could do is bleed some of those customers away from Wizards of the Coast to Paizo. Will they bleed enough over to make Wizards of the Coast fail as a company? No, not even close. It's just not possible. Statistically, that can't happen. Black Swan events are possible, but you wouldn't bet on that. But they could bleed enough over that it makes Paizo as a company grow drastically. And here's just a simple example of that. Let's say that throughout this entire OGL problem, Wizards of the Coast ends up losing 5% of their revenue, okay? So I've got some red arrows here. Each arrow is 1%, and you've got 1% down, 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 down. This money is just gone. The community gets so upset that they just don't buy products from Wizards of the Coast. They don't buy other products, they just play less Dungeons and Dragons. They play less role-playing games. They just spend less time in the community. They're probably unhappy because part of their hobby was taken away, but financially, it definitely impacts Wizards of the Coast. In past videos, most of my points have been they will happily accept a 5% loss to be able to shut out their competitors and have a chance that those shots to their competitors actually sink their competitors. Wizards of the Coast, just doing this little change, might completely take out, I don't know, Green Ronin. They might take out Chaosium or something like that. Will they take out Paizo? Not based on Paizo's persuasion ability. I think Paizo's got some incredible fight in them. They are punching way above their weight class. But it's far more likely that Wizards of the Coast could take out Paizo than Paizo could take out Wizards of the Coast, just because of the sheer size difference. It's really hard to overcome that. But let's say Wizards of the Coast lost 5% of the revenue, and Paizo wouldn't be so ambitious to imagine they could take that 5%. They would if they could, but they're not that foolish. They can't just convince every person who's leaving Dungeons and Dragons to come over and try Pathfinder. They will do it every time they have the chance, but they can't possibly convince everyone. But could they convince 20% of those people? Could they get 1% of WOTC'S losses to go over to Paizo? Yeah, that sounds plausible. Honestly, that sounds believable. It's still a stretch, but that's within the realm of possibility. That 1% loss for Wizards of the Coast is a 100% increase for Paizo. So even if it's a tenth of 1%, that's Paizo's debt paid off. Imagine you did something relatively small at your job to capitalize on a mistake that your boss made or something like that, and it ended up doubling your salary. Even if it was temporary, just that 1 year, if your salary was double what it is today, what would that do for you? Would that pay off your student loans? Would it make enough of a dent in them that it completely changes the trajectory of your life? Just about everyone would have their life completely changed for the benefit if they could double their salary for virtually nothing. All they did was release a press release. Paizo is exactly the same. Every company doing what Paizo has done to have the chance to increase their pay that much, their revenue that much, would take that in a heartbeat. And my point here today is Paizo did exactly that. They waited for the right time to release this. They clearly had this prepared in advance. When Wizards of the Coast was ready or had leaked on them, because I think Wizards of the Coast wasn't ready to release it at that point, but when it came out into the public sphere, Paizo saw it, said, now's our time. We make our plea to the community, and we put it out, we put it in action. They called up Azora Law, and Brian Lewis answered and said, it's time, I've got it ready. Let's get drafting, let's start recruiting other companies that want to be brought into it, and they moved right away. And they could get that out in time to be able to make sure the discussion for the community is not just how bad Wizards of the Coast is for doing this, because a lot of that is Paizo's idea too, but also how good and noble Paizo is. Wizards of the Coast might not care about that moral fortitude, but you guys as the players do. You've noticed that Paizo has done that, and even if Paizo's doing it for profit, the result is still going to be a better thing for you as the community. My point here today is to say, Paizo didn't do that because they're a good, benevolent company. There's no such thing. There are companies that are vehicles to try to make money. Paizo used their vehicle to try and make money, which is convince the community that WOTC's big and evil, and we're not big and not evil. And in doing that, they accomplished that goal and then some. And it might pay off hugely for them. In the long-term war, will they still be in trouble? Probably. If their goal is to end up replacing Wizards of the Coast or having a better product than Dungeons and Dragons, and by better, I should say more profitable and more revenue, that won't happen. If their plan instead is to say, you know what, we can't fight Dungeons and Dragons, they've got 50 years of a head start on us, or 30 years of a head start on us at this point. Their head start's too big, they're too big as a company, I can't compete with them, we can't drive them out of business. But what we can do is grow our own business to the next level, and instead of being a $13 million company, if we're a 25 or a 30 or a $40 million company in revenue, maybe some new options open up for us. They always do. Having more money is always better than having less money. And in trying to get more money, Paizo's persuasion game, A+ or S tier, however you want to look at it. In another video, I'm going to go over in the future about what Wizards of the Coast could have done to also have probably not S tier, but A tier persuasion. I'm also happy to delve deeper into what Paizo's been doing right or where they could have improved here as well. So let me know what types of content you would want to see towards this. Has this struck a nerve with you? Is this something you'd want to delve deeper into, or would you rather see some other topics? Let me know, and I'll happily take it where you guys want to see it. But until then, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.